Windy here. Actually, a piece of our little building here on the rooftop blew out last night. For more on this trial, let's bring in Brian Claypool. He's a criminal defense attorney who has prosecuted officers in police-involved deaths. So you heard the defense attorney there, Brian, talking about this, that this is not just one thing. This is about drugs. This is about hypertension. This is about coronary artery disease. This is about a paraganglioma that apparently George Floyd had that secreted adrenaline. But when you look at the video that was played this morning, in that trial, you have to ask yourself, would George Floyd still be alive today if not for the actions of Officer Derek Chauvin?
Yeah, John, good point about the causation, because regardless of whether it's second-degree unintentional murder or the third-degree murder, the prosecution has to prove what's called legal causation of death. And now defense lawyers have already previewed that they're going to argue there's a concept called excited delirium. I've seen this in a lot of cases involving law enforcement, that George Floyd's body reacted to the attack by Chauvin because he had drugs in his system, leading to his heart, blowing up and then having a heart attack. So causation is going to be really critical. Why is that important? Because the defense is going to have to call a medical expert, John. You can't simply say he died of another cause of death. There has to be a medical expert that's going to have to break that down. That's really important for the prosecution, too. Prosecution can't just rely on this videotape. It's horrible. We all know that. But prosecution has to put it in the right context. They have to argue specifically, John, that Chauvin intentionally inflicted bodily harm that led to the death of George Floyd. So they've got to prove that, and also that led to the cause of George Floyd's death.
So, Brian, and this is Sandra here, to that point, Nelson, Chauvin's defense attorney, Eric Nelson, said evidence in this case amounts to more than 50,000 items, saying, quote, the evidence is far greater than 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So what stands out to you most as far as what you have heard in that courtroom so far today?
Well, Matt made a great point. There's going to be evidence coming in of George Floyd being arrested previous and how he responded to that arrest, how his body reacted to that arrest. That should help the defense try to argue that you've got to look at the full picture here. They're going to say, hey, look, we've dealt with Floyd before. He's combative. He's a big guy. Chauvin might have had his neck or his knee on Floyd's neck. But Sandra, here's another key point. It's called a carotid chokehold. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, that was permitted in Minnesota at the time of his death. That should be a focal point of the defense. Prosecution is going to have to rebut that as well by saying, look, we have a police practices expert. They got to bring in an expert too. Somebody who's trained police officers, who knows whether you should use this chokehold. Just because you can use the chokehold doesn't mean it was required in this situation. And the prosecution is going to have to argue there should have never been a chokehold used here, but if Chauvin reasonably could have used it, he deployed it improperly, and that his knee on the neck cut off the blood flow to Floyd's head, which caused the death. So it's going to be an interesting battle, I think, of experts.
Brian, you said that the prosecution has to prove that Chauvin did this intentionally, but a couple of the charges, third-degree murder and manslaughter, are unintentional.
Right. Well, it's complicated, John. It's second-degree murder, so it means that Chauvin did not intentionally kill George Floyd. But in the definition of second-degree murder, prosecution has to prove that Chauvin intentionally created bodily harm or intentionally inflicted bodily harm on a suspect that's been detained. So the prosecution's got to show that Chauvin did this intentionally, that he put his knee on Floyd's neck to harm him. Now, in third-degree murder, prosecution's got to prove what's called a depraved mind, that Chauvin caused the death of Floyd with a depraved mind. So think about it, though. You've got to go into the mind twice there of Chauvin. So that raises the million-dollar question in this trial. Is Chauvin going to testify? How's he not going to testify and be able to prove that he didn't intend to harm George Floyd?
Brian, the jurors selected 3 black men, 1 black woman, 6 white women, 2 white men, 2 multiracial women. The 15th temporary alternate was dismissed. This is a very diverse jury that we are seeing here. We remember the search for these jurors. They couldn't find anybody who hadn't heard about or was knowledgeable about the case. The one juror hasn't seen the video. Just tell us a little bit about this jury as this trial is in day 1 here.
Yes, Sandra, great question. In my opinion, the chemistry of this jury pool favors the prosecution. Why? You've got at least, I think you said, 4 minorities on the jury. That's crucial. Trust me, I've had big cases involving minority defendants, and you need to have a minority on that jury. Secondly, you've got females on the jury. So that means you've got mothers probably on the jury who are going to look at that tape and say, wait a minute, this is murder. And then third, you've got some younger jurors, Sandra. That's important because they're not jaded. The jurors that would help the defense would be older white folks who might be more conservative, who might be more apt to look for reasonable doubt because they respect law enforcement. But when you have younger jurors, remember the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of young folks out there, protesting. And if you've got young folks on this jury, when you get back into that deliberation room, they are going to have a very vocal say on whether there should be a guilty conviction.
All right, to your point, multiple jurors in their 20s, at least 2, two in their 30s, and the age ranges go up from there, more in their 30s, 50s, and 40s. So we stay diverse when we're talking about racially, but also age-wise as well. Brian, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks,
you know what I find interesting, too, about the jury pool is that one mixed-race woman has an uncle who's a police officer.
Yeah. And
she knows about the use of restraining holds. And then the black woman who's on the jury has a relative who is a Minneapolis police officer. So you have some understanding of police tactics, but then again, nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. So we don't know how that's all going to break down. We'll see.
Yeah, really interesting jury pool there. All right, John.